Here.
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 Here. Okay, Madam City Manager.
Like it in
How about, yeah, Rev, you mind opening us with a word of prayer?
Let's bow our heads. We are reminded each day how spectacular it is to be in the presence of your anointing grace. How amazing it is for us together this hot and blistering summer day to feel the warm rays of the sun and yet be energized by your presence through the sun. Bless us in a way that we might be sensitive in our articulation. Allow us to be sensitive to each other. Allow your grace to cover us and every person in this room, and particularly cover this city with a kind of wise counsel and a deep and abiding faith as we continue to be smart and we are expanded. We ask it in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend McDowell. At this time, we'll begin the city council discussion with item 1, the Quiet Zone Committee report. Missy Gentry, Assistant City Manager, will open up for us, I think. I know that the Quiet Zone Committee is present, and I did take some liberty, Mayor and Council, to go ahead and schedule this. I did not forget that you wanted a dedicated work session on hospitality tax, but they, the committee had done such great work. I think it was timely for us to go ahead and do the work, and we will be very, we'll make sure we're time sensitive. So I think I've seen the committee report. I know that they're have put something together, and if we can just give them some time to get through the report without questions, I think that would help them out as well.
Absolutely.
I'm
Thank you so
sorry, I
much.
didn't know. Is Missy?
Missy suggested that we go
You
ahead
just go
and
ahead.
start with
Okay,
our
wonderful.
work.
I'm sorry.
No worries. So, thank you all for inviting us here today. My name is Brenda Kramer. I am the chairman of the Quiet Zone Advisory Committee. My vice chair, Patrick Cleary, will be presenting this afternoon. And when he's finished, if there are any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them for everyone. I'd also like to recognize members of the committee who are here. There's been a lot of work done, and Patrick is going to fill us in. If you're a committee member, could you just raise your hand? Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. At the onset, I want to thank council, particularly my neighbor, Councilwoman Devine, for letting us here today to explain what we've done and to show that the city can and should proceed with quiet zones. It's going to make a real difference to the quality of life for all the residents of this great city. At the outset, before I begin, let me thank city staff, particularly Missy Gentry. We have done an incredible amount of work since we first started in November. And without city staff's dedication and time, we wouldn't be where we are today. And I know Missy's not in here, but I know Missy and her team have done an incredible amount of work and want to thank them before we get started. Train noise. It's something everyone in this city hears. Trains, unfortunately, while an economic driver, are something that crisscross the city, but also affect everyone's quality of life. Under federal law, trains must, and I repeat, must, blow their train horn when they go across a public railroad crossing. There are over 60 railroad crossings in the city. And within half a mile of a train crossing, when the horn blows, it's a severe impact. Most registers about 110 decibels. That's equivalent to a jet engine if you're near a train horn. And there are over 60 neighborhoods in this city within half a mile of a train crossing. As you can see, and I think I don't need to explain this in great detail, there are certain parts of the city that are more effective than others, particularly around USC going up, paralleling Hardin Street, and then along 277. The green circles on this map are half-mile radius from every crossing in the city. So how do we address something? How do we get to reduce or maybe in the future eliminate train horn noise in the city? There is a defined federal process called a quiet zone. It's embodied and it's encapsulated in the Code of Federal Regulations that if we follow this process and meet the requirements necessary, we can create quiet zones throughout the city. And in those quiet zones, there's no requirement that the train blow its horn. In fact, unless there's an emergency on the train tracks or something in the discretion of the train conductor that is necessary to blow the horn, we won't hear train horns in those quiet zones. And there are over 800 quiet zones in the country. There are 5 that have been established in South Carolina. It's a well-known process. If we follow the steps as a city, we can and will create quiet zones. I know that in 2003, when the city looked at this before, there was concern that we'd go through the effort, make the infrastructure improvements, and not be able to get quiet zones. If we make the steps necessary, we can get quiet zones in this city. Yeah, 1 in Spartanburg, 2 in Rock Hill, and 2 in North Boston.
God bless you.
So what have we done? We've looked at how to create quiet zones in the city. Our committee members, along with city staff, have gone to nearly every crossing in the city. We know what's at each crossing, where they are, what work needs to be done, what infrastructure improvements are necessary to create quiet zones. We know how much it's going to cost, and we know the process for doing so. If we were asked, we could, working with city staff, get quiet zones throughout the city. We've developed a methodology for how do we implement quiet zones across the city. As I'm going to explain later, while it would be nice to create one big quiet zone for the entire city, because of the federal regulations, that's impossible. We're going to have to create multiple quiet zones. But we've developed a methodology that we think shows where the city can and most effectively could spend its money to create quiet zones, and a phased process to go from one quiet zone to what we believe are going to be 11 necessary in the city. We did not evaluate projects like grade separation, such as the Assembly Street project that's been talked about. We've only focused on the existing railroad crossings and the railroad lines as a city as they are today. I'm not going to bore you with the amount of work we've done, but we have met monthly. We've inspected railroad crossings. We're developing a comprehensive report so that the city knows exactly where the railroad crossings are, what they have, and what steps are necessary. We've developed, working with the Federal Railway Administration, the railroads, and other stakeholders, the costs necessary. And we know the process, once funding is identified, to begin implementing and adding the infrastructure improvements necessary to enact quiet zones. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are about 60 crossings in the city. Under South Carolina law, all that is required at a railroad crossing is the X crossbuck. That's what's known as a passive safety device. Some railroad crossings in the city have more, but to be in a quiet zone, every crossing in that quiet zone must have active safety devices, must have gates, must have lights, must have what's known as constant warning time, must have power out indicators. There is a litany of statistical information that these make crossings safer. So in addition to the quality of life, removing the noise, what we would do in quiet zones is improve the safety of each crossing in those zones. In addition to these minimum active safety standards, some, not all, but some crossings are going to require what are known as supplemental safety measures. Those might be medians, those might be quad gates, and some other engineering upgrades. But as you're going to see, the majority of cost is to get to these active crossings, active safety crossings. So what did we do? I'm going to show you on the screen a map of approximately 60 crossings in the city. So you can see they're a lot closer, just south of downtown. going up what is known as the R line. This is the one that goes through 5 Points, parallels Hardin Street, and goes up past Bull Street towards the northeast. We've identified 11 quiet zones. Now, I said earlier, why not just have one quiet zone? Unfortunately, under federal law, to have a quiet zone, it must be on a railroad that's owned by one railroad. We have 2 railroads in the city, CSX and Norfolk Southern. Must be contiguous, and it must be half a mile long or longer. Because of those restrictions, we had to create 11 distinct proposed quiet zones. The one we're going to talk about, see on the map here, starts near the Greek Village at USC, runs essentially between campus and downtown, goes by 5 Points, parallels Hardin Street, goes up just behind the Bull Street redevelopment project, and up to Beltline Avenue. This is the Gadsden to Beltline project. And as we're going to see, this is the most cost-effective way of reducing train horn disturbance in the city. So our approach was to identify the highest impact. Now, ideally, we'd like to see all the quiet zones implemented. We recognize that may be a challenge. Certainly, in one budget year, that may be a challenge. So we tried to identify a way to prioritize the quiet zones. So how did we do that? We looked at trying to develop a train horn disturbance calculator. For any given railroad line, what's the average number of trains? What's the average population within half a mile of each crossing? And what's the funding necessary? What are the infrastructure upgrades necessary to create those quiet zones? And as you'll see, ranking the 11 projects, the Gadsden to Beltline project, which encompasses 14 railroad crossings, for an estimated $2 million, can eliminate 61% of the train horn disturbance in the city. I'll repeat that again. $2 million can eliminate 61% of the train horn disturbance in the city. And these numbers, these estimated costs, are based on other cities that have done quiet zones. They're based on information we've received from the Federal Railway Administration and information from the railroads. These are, well, not exact, these are firm numbers. For about $2 million, 61%. Sorry, I skipped ahead to it. For the entire city, we estimate about $13 million with the contingency. But again, showing on the next slide here, the funding necessary to reduce the train horn disturbance. No expenditures. For an expenditure of about $2 million, 60% eliminated. For an expenditure of about $4 million, 75% of the train horn noise, or train horn disturbances eliminated from the city. So the question then becomes, how do you fund this project? Each quiet zone can be a standalone project. These projects are ones that I'm sure City Manager Wilson will appreciate. They're not something we're going to have to bid out. The railroads do most, if not all of the work. The city side work can be done in-house. Other cities have used general funds, capital funds, bonding, variety of sources. We should try and leverage other projects, knowing that there's some limited Section 130 funds from the state. It's unlikely we'll get federal funding. State infrastructure bank projects, we're not going to meet the minimum required for those. And railroads historically will not fund these improvements. But if the city were to spend $2 million, like I said earlier, 61% of the train horn disturbances are eliminated.
Can you just, so when we look at a crossing, and for the quiet zone, you talked about gates, lights. What is different that you have to add to it than, like, if I'm on, let's say, Lawrence and Green Street?
Sure.
There's gates, lights. What needs to be upgraded in those to make the criteria for the quiet zone?
Some crossings in a quiet zone will require what are known as supplemental safety measures.
Okay.
So some are going to have to get quad gates, and some will have to get medians.
So what's the difference? I don't know what a quad gate is.
So quad gates are 4. So on both sides of the road, the gates come down and block
Okay.
all the lanes of traffic.
Okay, so nobody can
That's right.
squeeze in.
The whole point is you can't go across and evade the gates.
Okay.
Some in a quiet zone will require medians or supplemental safety measures, not all. And where those are placed is a decision that if we were to move forward on quiet zones, city staff could determine.
And so the amounts, Patrick, that, like when you said the $2 million for which, that's why I wanted him to be able to get through this too. But you were taking into account the individual things, supplemental, for those 14 crossings that would have been the project that y'all will, in your next few slides, recommend.
Everything necessary for that quiet zone can be done for about $2 million. All the infrastructure upgrades necessary, all the construction, all the bid work, everything necessary can be done for that price.
And then they have the prices, Mr. Rickman, for, say, your question about for each particular crossing, what would be necessary. Some need more things than others.
Just trying to understand what we needed to
What is it?
upgrade.
Right.
So let me ask you this. The $2 million, of course, is a part of the 11 proposed quiet zone. 14.
14 crossings
Crossings.
in that quiet zone. So there are 11 distinct quiet zones, 14 crossings in
That
the
particular
Gadsden
one,
to Beltline.
which is the one that they feel will
Which is
give the
one
most
quiet.
impact.
That's one
That's
quiet.
one quiet, yeah.
Yes,
That's
sir.
the biggest bang for your buck in the whole thing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So he's gonna get into that if he can continue.
So help me figure out, so quiet zone costs versus cumulative citywide costs. Help me understand the difference between those two numbers.
Yeah,
Because
so-
obviously you see small numbers on one, I'm sorry?
So this is, the QZ estimated cost is the distinct cost for each quiet zone. This cumulative citywide cost would be how much to do two of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, 5 of them. et cetera.
Okay, I got you. Got you. Okay.
And so, obviously, we believe that and know that these quiet zones can provide substantial benefits to the city. Quiet zones can be implemented at stages. It's not, if we were to identify $2 million in funding, we could do the first project without having to have the funding for every single quiet zone across the city. Quiet zone, all the crossings in a quiet zone have active safety measures. We initially thought that the quiet zones were going to cost somewhere on the order of $25 to $30 million for the city, and as we've learned, it's substantially less. And they're feasible without waiting for large infrastructure projects.
That's what we thought initially.
Yeah.
You guys are a lot cheaper than that.
Well,
I
to
mean,
be
a
fair,
whole
you're
lot
right.
when we started, okay.
Mayor Benjamin, you're right. To be
Okay,
fair, you're
okay,
correct.
okay.
But they can be done without waiting for large infrastructure projects. The Gadsden to Beltline project that we're recommending is barely touched by any Assembly Street work. In fact, the vast majority of the benefits occur outside of the Assembly Street proposed project. They occur at 5 Points, they occur just south of USC, and they occur along Hardin Street and going up towards Beltline. And so what we recommend is that City Council adopt our methodology and approach in terms of prioritization of the quiet zones, proceed with an analysis of the Gadsden to Beltline project to determine preferred configuration and, to your point, Councilman Rickleman, where the medians and where the quad gates might go. Prepare for a funding request this year for construction documents. Brenda's going to explain in more detail the process from here to actually implementation. Include implementation costs in next year's budget discussions. And this is a point for city staff. Preserve the ability to include medians in roadway projects. And then finally, as infrastructure projects occur around the city, leverage other potential sources of funding, if available, to implement quiet zones. Thank you. Councilman Davis.
In your research, did you take a look or find data that shows the increase or decrease of auto train accidents where the quiet zones exist?
I'll take over for the Q&A now and let Patrick off the hook. So there have been some studies about safety within quiet zones. There have not been a lot. They have shown that there is no disadvantage to having a quiet zone. When they've looked at crossings before and after, the safety is statistically about the same. What you're really doing is you're trading off train horns for gates and lights and technology. The railroads would much rather use train horns. But the Federal Railroad Administration has determined that if you have gates and lights and certain types of technology, the crossings are about the same as far as safety goes. Now, what we've actually been looking at, and this might be a little bit too technical, but there's a calculator that the FRA provides that assigns a risk to every crossing. And so what the committee has done is look at what the calculated risk is for each corridor as it is without being in a quiet zone. And then we have added supplementary safety measures at crossings to get the quiet zone risk index below the current risk index.
The reason I ask, I think we know that most people who try to beat the train probably won't do it if they hear they hear the whistle. Now I assume that's where the medians come in.
So yes and no. I think it's important to understand part of the reason that the cost is not as high as we expected is because the Federal Railroad Administration does not require supplementary safety measures at every crossing, only at some of them. On the R line, we'd be looking at maybe 50% need those supplemental measures. The gates and lights are enough. Now, what will happen if somebody tries to beat the gates? First of all, it's illegal and it's highly dangerous. And in that situation, the train engineer will blow the horn just like he does today. An engineer always has the discretion to blow the horn if there is an emergency, somebody or something on the tracks, or during some routine rail operations. So really nothing would change if somebody's running the gates. We're still gonna hear the horn.
Just one other point observation. I always thought it was unfortunate that locally you have to pay for safety and beautification of train property. Have you run across instances where federal representatives, Congress, Senate, provide or can get financial assistance for projects such as this?
We
Rather
really,
than the local always having to bear the burden?
the burden falls substantially on the local authorities. There's minimal federal money available. In fact, some of the federal grants will actually explicitly disallow quiet zone projects. You know, the railroad takes the point of view, it's unfortunate, but the railroad takes the point of view that horns are their preferred method of protecting the crossings. They will participate at times when you're looking at a larger corridor project that is primarily safety oriented. Those would be projects generally that don't already have gates. Work like the Assembly Street project where there are grade separations being considered and road closings. The railroads will often participate there. They're very happy to participate if a city wants to close roads. My understanding is that City of Columbia would prefer not to close any roads, and so the railroads are not going to be inclined to participate heavily. And it's unfortunate, it really is, but that is the way it is. I mean, the nice thing is that back in 2003, when the city looked at this before, there really wasn't a defined process for this. Everybody was trying to figure out, what do we have to do? What kinds of safety measures do we have to have? If we do it, will we spend the money and then not get the quiet zone? And the Federal Railroad Administration has pre-approved a lot of these safety measures, things that Patrick measured, gates and medians. So as long as we use this calculator, we turn in this sheet of paper that says, here's what we want to do. We want you to bring all of our crossings up to this base standard. We want to put medians at 3 crossings and quad gates at 2 crossings. We're allowed to have the quiet zone.
So the railroads are required to know where and respect local quiet zones.
Yes.
What is their buy-in to that? What about CSX? What is their, if it's gonna be collaborative? Where is CSX and the other places? are they accountable? Are they willing to put some skin in the game?
Railroads are typically very unaccountable.
Railroads are willing to participate if Columbia is willing
They're
to.
better
pay roads.
protected
So,
than anybody else.
Right, or if there are bigger projects,
Okay.
like the
Yeah.
Assembly Street project down here.
Yeah.
My understanding is the railroads are very interested in helping with that because they're also affected by the traffic issues
So if we don't have any skin in the game
from the railroads.
from the railroad,
Minimal.
What do you mean, like money,
Yeah.
or you're talking about enforcing the
all
quiet
of,
zone?
all of the above.
I think once it's designated
Yeah,
as a quiet zone, they have to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, once it's designated, they're required to adhere to it.
So they then, there is some skin in the game if they're required to do that.
Well, they're not gonna participate financially.
No, they're not.
Upright.
Well, that's ultimately what I'm getting at.
No, sir.
No,
The skin in
That's
the
why we're
game,
having
of
this
course,
conversation.
resembles for me, how much is it going, how much are they willing?
They're not willing.
zero.
Zero.
Assume zero.
And we need to
That's
and
right.
we need to operate with that assumption that the railroads will be MIA as they have been.
They're protected better
We
than
have the
the other.
questions here.
I just, I did too.
What's the timeframe for the process? Like,
It's really straightforward. So the committee has done a lot of the preliminary work already. If we had hired a consultant, they would have done what we've done, which is to identify the crossings and figure out what needs to be done at each one. So at this point, we are very close to being able to file what's called a notice of intent, and that's what we'd like to work towards on the Gadsden to Beltline corridor. That notice of intent kicks off a 60-day comment period for the railroads, SCDOT, and the Federal Railroad Administration. They have 60 days to say, yes, we're good with this. No, we're not. Have you thought about adding a fence here instead of just a median? At that point, the railroad will ask the city to sign a contract for construction and engineering. We expect for that to cost for this first zone less than $200,000, probably closer to $150,000. They do the formal, the railroad does this. Their engineers provide the construction and engineering documents, and at that point, we'll have a final firm number, and the city can decide, okay, it's gonna cost $2 million, 35, whatever. We seek the funding, we sign the contract, and they do the work. If medians or curb extensions or things like that need to be done, my understanding is the city can do a lot of that in-house.
So as long as we fund it, they'll do anything, is what you're saying.
Exactly. They would be happy for us to pay for some of
Let me
their
ask a
upgrades.
devil's advocate question.
You bet.
So, I mean, ultimately, it would benefit us to have the trains obviously rerouted around the city, you know, using that transfer station that they have back there behind, what's that road? Anyway, back there behind Tuller's place, you know, obviously moving it around. Do you think there's any negative about us accepting quiet zones in the meantime and still pushing them, or is it just a step closer to get them to start to move outside the center city?
You know,
center?
nobody wants to spend money twice if they don't have to. Having said that, you know, how many years has the city been wanting to move these rail lines? Money was allocated for the R line at one point, and it was used elsewhere. And while I am completely supportive of moving and consolidating
Brenda, I don't think
lines,
that's not the case.
no,
No, that's not the case.
all right.
Yeah, it was allocated, some funding was allocated, but never, I think, I don't think ever made it past DOT or what have you, but it was not allocated and moved elsewhere.
Okay.
That's not true.
So, given that the process for moving, say, the R line hasn't started, you know, I looked at the timeline for the Assembly Street project, which is going through a NEPA study right now, and their timeline for completion, if it keeps moving forward, is something like 10 years. We aren't
Once we
even
can
at
get the
that
penny
point, right?
sales tax to pay for it,
So,
it would make much more sense, but.
moving forward with quiet zones now will provide substantial benefits while we wait for that.
And just so that I can understand, how many horns actually get blown throughout? Do we have
Oh,
a count of
boy.
that?
So-
Is it like every 100 yards? What do they do when they come through? 'Cause
The noise in parts of town is horrific, truly horrific. I've personally counted inside my home more than 100 blasts of a horn in less than 8 hours. We're talking about 10 to 15 minutes of constant noise, sometimes every hour, day and night.
I hear the train more than I hear the horn. That's why I was curious.
Yeah, and if you think about it, so the rule requires the horn to be blown in a particular pattern at every crossing. If you're within a half mile of a crossing, you're severely impacted. In a lot of cases, people are within a half mile of more than one crossing. So a student at Benedict in the honors dorm is within a half mile of 4 crossings. There's 18 trains a day on that line. 18 times 4 means that they're hearing the noise from 72 train crossings on an average day. And as you move into that area where the noise is more heavily concentrated, you've got points of interest that are within a half mile of 8 crossings. If your child is playing at Olympia Park, you're within a half mile of 18 crossings. It's a ridiculous amount of noise. There have been dozens of studies talking about the negative effects of exposure to that kind of noise. And all of these lines have trains at night. So now we're dealing with being awakened at night and sleep deprivation and all the health effects that go with that.
Brenda, the state of South Carolina shorts the city of Columbia $1.2 million a year that they owe us for the local government fund. Can we get a commitment from the senator from Richmond to fund us that $1.2 million and we could save that for 2 years and he could sleep all night?
Well, that's not a question I can personally answer.
I think the Democratic nominee for the Senate is outside the shot of the free times. That's live tweeting as we speak right here. But Trainer Harpootlian's over there, just so you know. The
To the councilman's question, 60 crossings in the city. The train goes its horn 3 times at each crossing.
For each crossing?
We have a range of 4 trains per line to 18. At an average of 10, that's 1,800 blasts a day. 1,800 blasts a day.
You all have any other questions? If not,
No, I
let's
just
try to
was
put a bow on
curious
this.
about that.
First of all, this is great work. This is great work, and I think seeing usually the facts lie somewhere down in the middle. I think when we started this, we were thinking it'd be 2-3 times that amount, at least 2 times that. And I think you guys know it's 25,000 across it. We're certainly right squarely in the middle of that. I will say I appreciate the hard work. The committee's been in here working hard along with Missy and the rest of the staff, really getting to the nuts and bolts of this. And I really appreciate the fact when you look at the zones that have been recommended, that there's a real focused effort to look at the span of downtown communities, not a focus on Shandon or Waverly, but stretching out to North and East Central Columbia as well. I think that's smart and obviously gets the results that we want. So the approach of finding the $200,000 first to start the engineering, and then us wrapping our heads around how we come up with the rest, and if it's within our bonding authority, obviously there's some things in here that are clear safety improvements that are not quiet zone related, but clear safety improvements, and cobbling together that is something we're going to have to put our nose to the grindstone on in the next few weeks, I would say. I mean, let's get on. You guys got more than to say grace over, but let's figure out how we start pulling this together to bring this to some type of conclusion, at least for the phase 1. But this has been excellent work, y'all.
Thank you. We'll be happy to answer any questions at any time.
Thank you, Brenda, Patrick.
Thank you very much for your
Thank you
time.
all. Thank you.
Minnie did a great job out in the field as well, is my understanding, so thanks
yes.
to Missy for working with them.
21, 34, 37, 42, 50, 53 crossings.
All right,
That's it, ma'am?
Mr. Mayor, we're going to move now into the original purpose of this work session was to have the time allotted for you all to dive into some policies and procedures. Before we do that, there's a couple of housekeeping matters because I wanted to kind of clear out the old and then make way for Dee Dee to take you forward. And the memo that we shared kind of outlines some of the additional funding requests that we received. I know there probably are others, and you all have. I did not. We can get copies if you all need it. We certainly can. And it was fairly simple. There were about 4 items that had come my way. And so obviously I needed to bring those to y'all's attention, but I'm aware probably that you may have some other items that you want to put on the table. So to avoid tonight there being a lot of discussion along those lines, we were trying to give you a little time here today. And then of course you can vote as you see fit this evening. There's an item on your agenda to take up any type of funding requests. And then there's the carry forward requests that I think are already really, we've attended to the Girl Scouts and the NCAA basketball tournament funds. Those are not really anything you have to take up. We just wanted to bring that to your attention. So we were going to go ahead and move those funds forward like the other carry forwards you've done. And then, of course, there was the committee recommendations that were held from July 17th, the South Carolina State Fair, and the USC Gamecock Club. And so we were suggesting that maybe y'all give us a little direction on those items, because some of them you might have to vote on tonight. And then we can get into current policy procedure, changing any policy and procedures, and the grouping of organizations. I think there have been some tiering suggested, so we were trying to give time for all of that today, but wanted to start with the old items if possible.
I'll go ahead and start it off, unless you had something to present independently.
Hey, we got a copy of that list.
No, sir.
The memo from Dee Dee, can we get
Dee
a
Dee's
copy
memo.
of it? Once she's out on Thursday?
Erica's printing it for you.
Okay.
Well, additional funding requests on here are Eau Claire Unity Festival, the Greenview Reunion, Epworth, and the National Collegiate Marching Band competitions. I support all 4 of those, and obviously the carry forwards support. I know we were supposed to talk a little bit more about State Fair and the Gamecock Club. The Gamecock Club, is that a pass-through, Teresa, or how, is that CPD, or how?
It is. I mean, that's really the mechanism that
And
we
them
can pay
providing-
our
providing
officers
traffic
so that
support.
there's not the, correct. so
Traffic
there's not
support
the
in football
taxing
games.
That would be applied if we paid them directly. I think that's really the gist of it.
I mean, obviously, I know you,
That's what I'm saying. If we did it, that's what will happen. Yeah.
so it's a much more efficient way of doing it.
Yes.
If we pay them, it goes through regular payroll, so it goes, all of their taxes, the retirement, and everything has to come out of that.
Yeah.
But the Gamecock Club paying it, they don't.
And obviously, we have these requests, and of course, the desire to try and get some type of keep some type of fund balance, or what have you.
And then we've got security cameras, which I just
Security
throw out
cameras.
there that's something we're going to be taking up in the next several months.
Quiet zone crossings.
Yeah,
Mr. Mayor.
all good things, all good things. Yeah, I know, and of course, we're not
And
voting,
we
we're just
didn't,
discussing.
I took no liberties with the amounts. Obviously, these are the amounts that
Requested.
were requested. That doesn't mean they're the amounts that you're.
Well,
Is it,
I have one too that's a new project that I'd like to put on the table for consideration.
What's that? Yeah, Mr.
Yeah, what's that?
Mr.
one of the things I think one of the things that I think we need to really be clear about is that there are new organizations that received HTAX dollars last year, and where in excess of about 1,000 folk, and I'm speaking specifically to one that I know of, and that was the Seco de Mayo Festival.
I got right here.
We did $5,000
Thank you.
last year, and of course, it was cut 50%. And I think that sort of discourages, I'm looking at these big ticketed, these big items here. And you got a new organization that has a proven track record, and it was cut 50%. And I'm trying to discern whether or not our priorities are the categories that are listed here. Is there a way as we journey through this whole issue of hospitality taxes, that there be some additional funds allotted to small organizations that's really making a difference for our city?
Problem
So
is all
that-
the organizations are in your district, and your district takes up all the funding.
All well and good. All well and good. I mean,
Last year, did the committee appropriate that, or did the council
Should've
appropriate
told me
I,
that.
I think it was a council appropriated that. It was
Yes,
an
sir, council.
additional,
What was the name of the group?
Cinco de Mayo.
It was the language buzz.
That's correct. Didi and I have talked a little bit about that. And the thing that, the larger issue for me is that we are appropriating monies everywhere. What about those small places? Those small events, those small vendors that's really making a difference for our city?
That was one of the points, Reverend McDowell, for the moving forward discussion.
All right, is that-
Yes, sir,
all right,
like
good.
grouping and
Okay, good.
organizational.
So that's gonna
Larger
come.
discussion, yeah, we did have a larger philosophical discussion.
All right.
Yeah, and I was gonna add that, but
What kind of discussion?
Philosophical.
I was gonna add that, I know that's part of the proposal is maybe hearing them so that you have that, but I do wanna caution us, because I know that when groups come to us, they say things like, we were cut, we were this, and we were that. We need to recognize that if someone is funded from council, and then the committee does what they did last year, the committee did not cut them. You know, the committee did what they did last year, and with the amount of funds that they have, it's very hard for them to open up to new organizations, because I think they try to, but because of historically the organizations that are there and that have a track record, I think it's hard. So I just think it's incumbent upon us to be cautious that we can look at how to fund these groups, but it gets people mad at the committee, and then people say, well, the committee did this and the committee did that. That's not accurate. When we go back and we add additional funds, or we fund somebody outside of the process, and then they do the process and they do an application, and the committee doesn't fund them, you know, and we get mad at the committee did what they did last year, and so I just would caution us that the way we have that narrative, because people in the community will say that the committee is cut somebody, or the committee is racist because they don't fund black organizations, and, you know, all that stuff, and that's really not
They
accurate.
haven't been cut, we just haven't done any additional appropriations.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and in all fairness, the majority of the people that come back are the same people year after year. I mean, historically, you can go.
That's
Right.
And that's one of the
So
reasons
there's
why we ought to.
obviously something there.
Mr. Davis? Yeah, I think Tamika had something too. Go ahead, Sam.
No, I agree with some of Tamika's points, but I think I've always stuck with the original intent of the pot, of the dollars, even respecting where they come from, that the organizations should not just live solely on these dollars, because of the mere fact that it's a distribution process, number one. And nothing is guaranteed. And I think unless, quite frankly, some organizations tend to get less than they normally do, then you can't bring in other folks. If this is their only bloodline, then they won't survive. You know, so they shouldn't expect to survive on this pot of money. And some of them, I think we've been very generous over the years. But I'd like to see us figure out a way to bring in newer organizations. They don't have to come in first
Smaller
time.
amount of dollars, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some organizations come in for the first time and they're getting 100,000. and some come in for the first time and don't get nothing. So we've got to figure out a way
It's called
to make that work, whether you come up with more criteria or you streamline the criteria we have now.
I'm sorry,
Now, I'm finished.
Ms. Devine, you had some organizations or requests you wanted from the table?
Yeah, and unfortunately, hopefully the
We can do it
proposals
later.
come in. No, hopefully the proposals come so you have it, but, there is, an effort to, in conjunction with International Women's Day, to do, a recognition and a City of Women, patterned after Ann, Stolnitz's, essay about the City of Women. They renamed parts of, or honorary renamed parts of New York after prominent women. And the write-up is a lot more eloquent than I can give it, but it's being led by Rachel Hodges, myself, Robin Waits, USC. It's a partnership, but anyway, it's a new idea. I'm gonna get the proposal, but because it just came up, it'll bring in folks from all over, and like to put that on the table for proposal. They're asking for $50,000. The total budget's about $200,000. USC has committed to pay for Ann Stallnet to come into town and do symposiums around the whole importance of women in the history of cities, and then they're looking for other funders as well.
This is street renamings and monuments and the like, or
Monuments.
we're recognizing? I mean, I'm thinking other than honorary renamings like Sarah Mae Fleming Way or something like that. We have very few, if any, streets at all in the city.
Yeah, they actually at the first committee meeting they did the list.
Not
of,
other than
well,
Martha
well,
Washington.
and you know what the interesting
He
part.
said ladies.
Well, the interesting, but I would say the interesting
It's George
part that
Washington's
came up-
lady. That was
that
George
came-
Washington's
yeah,
lady.
that came up, I didn't know that. The interesting
Yeah.
part about that, it came up at the committee, Robin reported, is that Lady Street was named after Martha Washington, but they didn't even give her a name. They
George
just
Washington's
said
lady. It's George
Yeah,
Washington's
right.
lady.
Well,
It's on the
Yeah.
next street, Lady Washington.
yeah. Well, I mentioned to your colleagues, I think it's a good idea if they use Lady Street for the naming of several women. You probably can do 3 or 4, 5.
So it'll
That's
be
meaningful.
It'll be monuments.
He
We're
was very
looking at
creative.
maybe
Look forward to
possibly
seeing that.
walking tour and some other things. So it's very preliminary. But Rachel wrote up something, and unfortunately she
That's
brought it
exciting.
here, and somebody told her I wasn't here, so she dropped it off at my office. So I'm trying to still invite my office to pick it up.
Okay, look forward.
Yeah.
Mr. Rickaman?
I want to throw in the mix too is, 5 Points has suffered quite a bit from the negative press and so forth. And one of the things that I think would be very beneficial is that we look at funding their clean and safety like we do the other 2 entertainment districts, and allowing them to use the funding that they generate to do improvements throughout, which is investing more in upgrading 5 Points itself to be more of attractive. They've got a real solid plan, and I think it's worth our discussion. Obviously, my first inclination was I think it'd be a 3 to 5 year plan. With bringing in the various artists, fixing up the alleyways, much like we have on Main Street, where you can cut through, because most people don't use next to music to cut through. People don't use the alley over at by Rite Aid to come through from parking that we provide. Doesn't get used because it's sketchy, and it's been that way for 30 years. But they're willing to take on those projects and use their funding. And I think the idea would be is that we would fund their clean and safety, which is, I think, roughly $125,000 right now, out of hospitality, which would be equal to what the other entertainment districts are getting.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mitchell.
So we're actually talking about two trains of thought. One for new applications, and another, of course, for those applications that were funded but funded partially. And perhaps a resubmission, not a resubmission, but an allocation of additional funds. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I guess today, today specifically, we have some specific requests, some before us, some to be before us, that we'll have to allocate. I think in terms of philosophy moving forward, yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we have a system that works well as constructed, if we're trying to do what we're currently trying to do. I think there are obviously some opportunities to think much broader, much more strategic, 20,000 feet, but also very granular, grassroots, helping us target some opportunities that I think actually I don't want to necessarily be structured the way the county has it, but I would like to see individual district representatives have a little more authority to meet some issues. Your district's a little hinkier, I mean, because you get all downtown, but meeting some of the more community needs in your district in thoughtful ways, I'd like to find ways to kind of meet some of those needs. I think Daniel's position actually obviously has merit. I think it's kind of exciting here, and the idea Tamika presented as well. And I think the way we eat this elephant is one bite at a time. Let's deal with the requests before us and whatever additional ones, including those two, and Cinco de Mayo, if we need to consider that, put that back on the table. I know there was a request from Greenview. Was that 20 or 25?
Well, I was trying to get 25, but John and I had a round table with them.
Yeah.
I'll stay with 20.
But
They would
obviously,
prefer 25 if we can, but if 20 is the limit today, then that's the limit.
no, Claire's is pressing. It's like now.
No,
And
theirs is Saturday.
It's Saturday, and then obviously we still want, as best as we can, want to leave something in the pot for whatever prospective needs that we have coming.
Yeah.
I like the idea of ramping up 5 Points Clean and Safe. I think we tried to do something years ago, and they were interested in doing their own thing, but
They're doing it more economically than
Yeah.
other, but everybody has their own way of doing
their
things.
own. Yeah, I think the districts are
Be done
the districts
by
are all.
the city
But it's,
Well, districts are all distinct. But I think
No, it should be shared by everybody, because if you're in the old days, the merchants cleaned out in front of the stores. Nobody does that anymore because they got hospitality money to do it.
There's still the specific request. Let's try to leave something in the pot.
How much pot do we have? This doesn't say, this just got a request, but it doesn't say how much Jeff's gonna let us have.
We have a number for you.
is it a durable number where additional things can take place after this is done?
Yes.
Perhaps. And I'm through after this. Will there be an opportunity, because there is a project or a proposal that I'd like to bring to the table at a given time?
Well, I think obviously if we leave something in the pot, then that gives us opportunity to come back and
We got something. We got something.
if that's up to us and how we act tonight.
Yeah,
I-
you do. I don't
I will
know
say-
how much
and I
longer
will say this,
this
and I
pot's
know-
gonna be cooking.
Well,
I
let's
know
make
that-
some phone calls.
I know that
Well, that ends the discussion then.
we're
When it's empty,
we're
it's
also
empty.
going through the process of looking at arts funding, throughout the region. One Columbia's been helping us with the staff that process, and I'm sure at the end of that day we're going to have some additional insights as the things we could be and should be doing there as well. That should help inform our larger discussion at some point, not direct it, but inform it. Ms. Devine, then Mr. Duval.
The only other thing I would say is, and not to kind of rehash everything, but it might be helpful, Dee Dee, for us to get what was approved from the committee recommendations. And I just say that, I just caution us again, because what tends to happen is, if we've heard from one or two folks, language buzz, this person, that they didn't get funded, and then we go back and we fund them, which is, is good, but what happens to the groups who accepted what they were given and didn't come back and say, I need more, and then we didn't look at it? That's, I think, where we really get wrapped around the axle, and then we get all kinds of folks, once we vote to allocate the additional funds to these handful of groups, then we get all these other people coming outside of cycles that, well, what about me, and every week we're looking at and entertaining other requests. So in order to be fair and to do it, if we're going to do one or two, everybody needs an opportunity to look at the list and see if there's concerns, and commit to do it and deal with it and leave it alone versus every week we're hearing from someone who needs additional money.
Mr. Duval.
Well, as the mayor said a minute ago, One Columbia has been doing the Amplify study of the arts and cultural part of our community development, not community development, but our comprehensive plan. And I met with Margie Reese, who is the consultant in Texas, last week after her presentation to a group at Capital Cities Club. And she says that we need to carefully look at our policies. And going back to what Tamika said, she thinks that the council's habit of taking additional funds and giving them to special groups here, there, and yonder screws up the process. That we need to establish a funding process. The one I like is going through the tiered groups that I have mentioned before. Let the committee do its work, and then council either accept or change that. But after that, we don't allow anybody else to come in and put in an additional request. And if we have a surplus at the end of the year, that goes back into the pot for the committee to use.
Yeah.
It's we on council that are creating problems not only for the administration of the HTAX, but for the council ourselves, because we allow the groups to come to us and we get extra money from them.
Which we're all guilty of.
Which we all guilty of. I admit that.
Yeah, and
So I guess
some of it,
But we need to be more restrained.
In Margie's and all of this, the problem I have with the tiered system that I have is when you look at the expenses that aren't eligible, how much we've been paying out already in those. And we have to either, if we're going to follow that, what is the recourse and the accountability on it? Because, we're paying for gift cards for people to give away, which is not ineligible. We're not supposed to pay for drinks, toilet paper, things like that. We are reimbursing currently on that. So we have to change the way we're allowing people to spend the money because it's not eligible.
So all of
Rent,
that
office
is-
supplies, this
We have a list
administration.
of items for you too, once you got into that part of the
So,
discussion.
and people's confusion of, you can use for tourist-related buildings, but that doesn't mean we can buy flags for street signs and stuff like that. But we're reimbursing all this. We have got to change. If we're going to a different system, then we need to have the mechanism that we can hold them accountable for. And that's what I'm concerned about, this automatic no reimburse, because we're already making mistakes that could come back on us.
well, I think if we work more at some clarity and put it out there, that's number one. What is allowable, what is not. And I would like to see us give the tier model some serious discussion and then make a decision on it.
So, do y'all wanna deal with these older items now first? Or do you wanna move into those
You mean the
discussions?
Gamecock Club and, is that?
Well, I meant,
All the-
that too, but that's probably actually gonna be easier than if there's some other items that you'll wanna vote on tonight, or are you just gonna take them up tonight?
I agree. I'm sorry, I missed part. I'm ready to move forward with all the additional funding requests. Actually, all three categories. I'm fine with. I know there might be some discussion around the ones in the middle, but we gotta help with traffic and other issues with the football games. So it's just gonna be Charlie Foxtrot. I'm fine with all the items listed. I'm fine with an additional $5,000 for Greenview. If we want to do this and then take another fresh look, however, whatever process you guys agree with, and start with the phase-in, 5 points, clean and save, language buzz, and I'm excited about what Ms. Devine just laid out. Let's do that, but let's just try to make some commitment and leave some money in the bank, because I will tell you, we know us. Things are going to pop up, and it'd be nice to have at least something to rely on there. I'm not sure if I support another cycle necessarily, but those issues that we have before us, obviously, people listen to the sound of my voice right now. There's going to be a flood of other stuff popping up.
Well, I already know one right now that I didn't raise, but they brought it up, and it does honestly comes up every year, and every year I put it up and advocate it. But Black Expo, I mean, the committee I think gave them maybe 10,000.
Yeah.
You know, Didi,
Was it 20?
Is it 20?
15.
Yeah,
significantly low,
less. Yeah.
considering the amount of money it takes to put on that. And be quite honest and transparent, every year we're doing it. It comes up, and I know that Howard proposed that as, you know, there are certain groups that come up every year that we know that the committee never is able to give them the level that they need to actually do their event. I think Auntie Karen might be one as well that, you know, typically comes up. So I just, before we start allocating, I think we need to monitor the ones that we know usually come up and either say this is it and we're sticking to it, or deal with it now.
We obviously, on the things that are before us, we need to make decisions tonight. So let's get those out of the way.
I'd like us
They were
to
5,000.
sit down with
5,000.
Black
They got
Expo
5,000.
and
Black Expo,
how much?
5,000. I mean, there's no way.
You see, look, can we,
They,
Ed,
Yeah.
I want us to sit and talk with Black Expo and Auntie Karen.
Now, if you remember,
Committee?
now, I think you're right. If you remember, last year I was one of the dissenting votes. I asked that we reconsider that until there was appropriate conversation with Black Expo to see whether or not those dollars were accountable.
Yeah, one thing we need to do in both cases is sit and talk with them. One of the most meaningful discussions I've had that brought us to today was talk with John. I had some very candid conversation for the sake of clarity in the two issues. Am I right, John? And in some cases, I think that doesn't hurt to do that.
So let's kind of get those things off the table. Do we have an idea of when the Amplify will be done? When they'll be done with their process? It's still a while, right?
What she wanted to do was come back and talk to the council in November.
Yeah, she gave me a pretty serious briefing too last week. So I mean, it can inform our process going forward. It can inform our process going forward.
She likes the tier system, and I understand Daniel's
So can we
concern
get,
about
can we
funding.
get something put in there
What?
that resolves that issue?
Let's see what she has. Let's see what she knows that can help
I
us with
know,
that.
but when we don't make them reimburse, it just, I'm telling you. When you look through that stuff, you go sit there, you'll be shocked yourself.
We need to work with the accounting department on it.
Guys, and look, with the
I'm good.
hey, can we have just a good faith effort to let's take up the items that are in Dee Dee's memo before us, and maybe and I think unless there's some dissension, Cinco de Mayo is not for a whole nother year, so we're good.
Yeah, I'm not, no, not just that.
But we can.
You can
we
bring
take
it up next July.
But we'll just take them up
That was just an example.
either in the affirmative or the negative.
Yeah.
We'll take them up with. I think we need to make some agreement, some consensus on if we're going to do 5 points clean and safe. Let's do 5 points clean and safe, and let's start phasing that in.
I was down there this week.
But other than that, let's see if we can limit the discussion to these tonight. I'm fine with the support in Greenview a large amount, and let's handle the rest prospectively. Let's just figure out what we're going to do. I really like that. I can't wait to get that memo from Rachel.
I'm getting Missy to make
Was
a
that-
copy for me. She needs her map back, but this is the map of the city of Wimmenford, New York. It was actually along the,
Pink map,
yeah.
pink and green, actually.
I know. It's got some orange in it.
How much you asking for?
50.
And two more things again. Let's determine moving forward, again, the rigidity and flexibility that we're talking about in terms of reporting and making sure that funds are being spent on the right thing. Let's have Amplify help inform our process going forward. I really do think that a portion of funds, and I don't know what it looks like, we got to make sure we're all approving and voting on it. But I think the district reps having some ability within their council districts to help direct funding can help out prospectively. I mean that's just something that we got to figure out what that looks like. I don't want to go the county council route, but I think that's very helpful. And again, I think we're going to just have to be a lot more strategic in the funds. I got some additional thoughts, and I'll just throw one out there. Not for consideration tonight. It's not in the memo. But we ought to carve out a little bit of funding to do some internal marketing, meaning just inside the city, inside our MSA. We spend a lot of funds marketing people outside of the city if it's legal to market to people inside the city, because our greatest asset and at times our greatest liability is that we can either talk up the city and things that are happening here culturally, amazing things happening here, or we can talk it down because people just don't know about what's happening.
Local folks will support things when others won't come.
I mean, a very strategic marketing campaign so people in the city know what's going on in the city. And that's just a thought. We need to start talking to ourselves a little bit. We go 50 miles outside of Columbia, we see some of the best billboards you've ever seen, but they're not in the city. And that's just, folks in the city need to know what's happening too, so we can turn everybody into our own megaphone.
Well, one of the
This
things,
map is just
Thank you.
people, I mean, these aren't, I'm a little confused of what they're trying to do, because this map, half these people didn't live in, I mean, they might have lived in New York, but they weren't born there, weren't from there. I mean, Nicki Minaj and, I
That's
mean,
what gave her the inspiration for it.
Lucy Liu, and, I mean, Jacqueline Onassis is not from
So
New
y'all
York.
are working on the
I mean,
model.
I guess,
Yeah.
What you want to do?
That's what gave her the idea. We're working on it now, and we'll get some input. But here's her memo or letter to me. But basically, the concept is to work with Historic Columbia and look at
Is Nicki Minaj really on?
women who are. I didn't realize they had Nicki Minaj on this. But look at women who contributed.
I like the
Past and
concept.
present of the city, and it wouldn't be renaming anything in particular, but it's reimagining the city and making an effort to accentuate the contributions that women have made to the city, past, present, and how it will look at the future.
And how does that fall into the H-Town?
Because it'll be part of International Women's Day, and the goal is to actually, Ann Stallman, who is nationally known for her essays on this, if she comes to speak, we can publicize it and get other folks in and actually make a whole event. We're thinking about reaching out to women-owned businesses and having them do different promotions, and you're really just encouraging women to come in and participate in.
And this is
You-
a very
I
interesting list.
shared the thought with y'all in the past. I'd love the idea of having more statues of women in our city. I'd love to have a statue of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. Looking
Statues and monuments
looking at the
are out
statue
these
of
days.
J. Marion Sims, three of his subjects that he operated on in the 1800s. But you think about people who just lost Sarah Leverett. I mean, and Jean Toll, and Majestic Simpkins, and Sarah Mae Fleming. I mean, there are more than enough opportunities to find local women to highlight and recognize throughout the city. I think it's an exciting idea. And,
When you say local,
What's the
are you
budget?
talking people
200.
who born and lived here,
I
or
think who made a contribution here.
just contribution?
And we also recognize the fact we're the state capital too. We're also the state capital. Sam, and recognizing we're the state capital. So if it's September Clark, I mean, Mary McLeod, Mary McLeod,
Pat Benatar.
Somebody like her, then.
yeah. I mean, I think that's a neat idea.
Steve,
Yes, sir.
may I see?
Yes, sir.
Interesting list.
Oh, please don't read anymore. That's the New York City version.
It's pretty cool what they did.
Let me say a word.
Yes, sir.
Hopefully this is a word of conscience. I think this is absolutely wonderful when you do it. I think that there's a greater issue in our city. I think there is a health pandemic that is not being talked about in Columbia. We are number 8. We are number 8 in the nation for hepatitis C and the AIDS virus. Number 8. There's not been a whole lot of conversation because if any of these things, these creative things are going to take place, our city has and got to be healthy.
A healthy,
A healthy environment, has a lot to do with the expansion and what takes place in this, our city. Number 8, and it was number 12 a year ago. It's number 8 in Columbia, the HC virus and the HIV virus. We've got to do something that's going to impact our city in such a way when we have things that are very important to our city. I think it has to be it has to be an effort that's going to impact it in such a way that healthy lives are going to improve within the confines of our city. I bring that up primarily because that's a part of a proposal that I am thinking about and talking to some folk about. There has to be an alliance, there has to be some collaboration. Remember, we have not talked about this issue called health. We've had summits, diabetes, cancer is on the rise. Our young millennials are being taken. We look at them one year and the next year they're dead because of the HC virus and the AIDS virus. We got to do something, folks.
Yeah, we talking about the fast track cities thing. Is that?
Is it?
I got an email from the state epidemiologist Linda Bell, right on point with what you're talking about.
That's a part of the conversation we've had with her. Epidemic.
Yeah, and she's a DHEC. I mean, so it's one lead in
Shouldn't we
charge.
try to support DHEC and maybe getting the message out? But I don't believe that's our role.
No. I'm not saying that ought to be our footing.
We ought to be.
There ought to be some information available in each one of our community about the rise of HC and AIDS. Look, diabetes, same thing. I got folk in this room right now who are diabetics and don't know it. I got folk in this room, perhaps, who are on the verge of amputation and don't know it because their A1C is so darn high that's ultimately we suffer from either misinformation or no information. And I just think at some point, I'm not saying, Daniel, that the city has anything other than getting information out, bringing in a group of folk who will be able to answer the questions.
We can't do that with H-Tax.
No, I'm not looking at no H-Tax money.
He just was sidebarring.
Good grief.
Just to get our minds off
look,
the H-Tax for a few minutes.
This is a passionate issue, not an H-Tax issue.
I think she's ready to talk to.
I am.
I just
400.
and I'm a diabetic and I'm eating all this sugar, probably because I need to step aside and do something about it, take a shot or something. My point, I'm sorry.
My brother was
my point is,
Ed.
I'm sorry.
My brother was diabetic.
Yeah.
So you need to.
It's very critical, I think. This is not an H-tax issue. This is not it's an international women's issue. It's also a health issue that's going to impact our city with such ferocity that millennials are going to die. And older folk are going to suffer because of this health pandemic.
Sure. As we transition back, I just send everyone the email from Dr. Bell talked to everybody again this weekend, asking us to partner with DHEC
That's
and some others on particularly on STD, HIV issues, not hepatitis, not Hep C, but the 200 fast-track cities now supporting what they're calling 90-90-90 initiative.
that's correct.
Provides details. The goal is that by 2020, 90% of all people with HIV will know their status, and 90% of those diagnosed will receive sustained antiretroviral therapy, and that 90% of those receiving the therapy will achieve viral suppression. That's a goal, and thinking that if we take that strategy, we can stamp it out in the epidemic.
And that's
So,
just think.
yes, sir.
HC can be cured in 14 days. Once upon a time, when you were diagnosed with HC, you died. No question about it. They got a new med on the market. It's called Havon. I can't pronounce. I don't remember. Man, get out of here, man. No soda bottle.
Harvoni?
Oh, absolutely.
Harvoni?
Havon. It's
Yeah.
for 14 days, a person can be cured of
Hepatitis C?
HC 14 days, and you know folk who have died. So it's
So we're gonna need somebody internally to help quarterback that. As it relates to HTAX funding, we okay. Teresa, what was the magic number on total? 475.
I'd love for you all to hold some.
Yeah, okay. Ms. Devine?
No, I was just gonna say, just echo what Ed is saying, but just for us to keep in mind, and Ms. Wilson and her staff are gonna talk to us about this at our retreat. But what I think, we did a lot with Envision Columbia and really have some concrete goals. What we need to do is look at how our budget and our funding priorities align with getting us
Getting the goals.
to that desired state, and then look at how do we partner, fund, do other things to support those things. But I say that to say that we're going to have to take a real hard look at, we're not going to be able to be everything to everybody. And we need to look at how do we fund certain things that help us get to where we need to be and align with our goals. And it doesn't mean a project's not worthwhile, but it also, might mean we're not necessarily the ones who need to fund it, even if we traditionally funded it. So with that said, Ed, that aligns with what you're talking about. I mean, when you look at our goals, we want a healthy community. And that means overall, as far as having, walkable communities and dealing with and partnering with people that can address the epidemics that are in our community. So we just need to keep that conversation in mind as we move into our retreat, and then maybe we can address it through that mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Duval.
Well, if everybody's putting their wish list out here for the 475,000, I want to ask for 35,000 for the state museum. They were cut from 48,000 to 15,000, and 35 would get them back to essentially what they had from last year.
Well, I don't know if we were putting together our wish list, but if we are, I have some.
Well, you
things
got
on the wish list.
50,000, you put
No,
50,000.
that was my
That's not-
project.
No,
This is two different things.
I think we're gonna stick with the things that are on this list right now. But as we go
I don't
go
have a
forward,
problem
I mean,
with
I don't care if it's next meeting. If you guys
Well,
want
I'll
to
just
put
throw it
those in
out
the
there.
hopper.
They
Yeah.
were, and I will say,
Statement.
they were not
growing
cut,
up.
they were not cut, but I will say that Hip Hop Family Day has grown over the
Oh,
years,
absolutely.
and we got some
Absolutely.
amazing national coverage on that this year. And I know that other cities, because of the national coverage, are looking to
Trying to
take
steal-
them
or
away.
trying to steal
Yeah.
them.
So we need to look at upping that.
I couldn't agree more.
And which one is that on?
It's under CMFA,
It's in the CMFA.
Okay.
It's a fiscal agent. I couldn't agree with you more than that.
and if we could, Dee Dee, could you, so everybody has that, what were we in, Family Circle, what was that? I don't
Yeah, Family
remember.
Circle Magazine.
Yeah,
Family
the
Circle Magazine.
national coverage that
It was
Family Day got.
the number one family,
Okay.
the number one family-friendly, event in South Carolina, is Hip Hop Family Day.
So
If you
what we're
hadn't
looking
been
at
to one, you need to
just
go.
this list. We're not gonna look at
Yeah,
5
right.
points, we're not gonna look at
Yeah,
the
we're
museum.
gonna hold, but let's see. So it's like when we're done.
So we're talking about an additional funding request, 115, committee recommendations, and I oppose,
Which one is
68,000.
this, Daniel?
What form are you looking at?
Well, the 68 was held, so it actually
big
was
one.
in the committee,
How do you
so
go back?
that wouldn't be that wouldn't be in
Yeah,
that
you all
portion.
don't need to deal with the bottom four.
It would,
Those are accounted for.
Well, no, we still have to vote
I
on
made her
those
upgrade
two.
mine. I
as
couldn't
well,
read it.
but it's
Yeah.
not included in
But
the
do the bottom four.
Yeah, I mean, as far as funding.
Yeah, not including 475?
No, because the money was already set aside, we just held it, so.
So we're talking about 360 being left over if we do the top four. Okay. And how much cameras?
I'd love for you to hold 75,000. That's what we've tried to do.
Well, that'd be great, and then we could put 125 to 5 points, that's 200, that leaves us with a little money in the bank, I love it. It's a winner, it's a winner.
If you can, if you can.
Gateways. What's the State Museum request again? I just gotta,
35,000.
what is it?
Well, the request was 100, they gave them 15.
said,
Last
what
year
will
they
it
got
fund?
48.
What's the request? It's just advertising tourism?
Yeah, it's for promotion. It's one of the second largest tourist attraction in the Midlands.
Okay. All right. Spend a little time on this as we go forward.
How much do they generate?
Bunch.
How much they generate in hospitality tax? None, right? 'Cause
I
they don't
think,
serve
I think
anything.
we ought to maybe get some numbers on that, because, you know, we started out, didn't we give them 5 million over?
Well, you gave
Over
them, they
over
were funded
five-year period?
$100,000 for years, and then they got into a construction
Right.
project, and they agreed not to do any, to put it all into the capital, and when they got out of the capital, they didn't go back to the $100,000, they knocked them down to about 10.
No, I'm just saying, I think it would be good to answer that question, how do you do that, though? How much do they generate?
We got some time between now and then. Let's get into the list. I think we're good on this evening, even if we change course. We're good this evening. Let's keep it moving right now.
Go ahead and add the 175, that's perfect, that leaves us 165.
Okay, we're good.
All right, so we will have a
And that
funding
motion tonight.
request
I can't
item on
find
your
one
agenda
strand of hair
tonight,
on
or
this
there is
page.
one on your agenda tonight.
Maybe
We'll
just
just
some lipstick on.
I'm sorry,
Listen,
was that,
at that time.
Ms. Wilson?
I said we have an agenda item for you tonight, Mayor, if you want to complete your discussion.
Absolutely. We definitely got on the agenda.
All right. So Dee Dee, a lot of what, I think she still wants to talk through, you kind of mentioned, so Dee Dee can kind of breeze through some pieces of this, but just seeking a little clarity for some others as far as moving forward.
Good afternoon.
How long you been saying? You know we appreciate you. We think you're amazing.
Thank you. I want to briefly discuss some of the things that you're already aware of, which is our current process and policies. But I wanted to specifically touch on some details of that and hopefully answer some of the questions and discussions that have came up in the past, as well as discuss some things that internally, staff-wise, that I'm working on that will help with some of the discussion as well, and some of the expenditures. So the first slide that I have is just what we've discussed before, the 3 methods that we currently have for hospitality tax grant allocations. All allocations from hospitality tax and must meet state law and the city guidelines as well, and the use of hospitality tax and public use. We have the 3 ways, the council-funded line item agencies. Those are the ones that are usually funded quarterly because they meet those requirements. The applications are submitted annually. They're provided for city council review and screened by administrator of the H-Tax funding program. The committee does not consider or review the applications for line item agencies. The allocations are typically flat, they remain the same each year, and they are approved by city council in the budget. All the line item agencies have a specific city connection, whether it be city-owned building, maintenance contract, upkeep of the buildings, statutory relationship, or city-sponsored outreach or community enrichment. Then we have the Hospitality Tax Committee recommendations. Established with the adoption of the H-Tax ordinance as a way for City Council to equitably and efficiently evaluate requests for funding. I have another packet too that I gave you guys that it lists all of the questions on the application that covers some of the questions that you had, all of the data that we get from these groups that are applying. But we have groups from we have our major neighborhood associations, we have arts and cultural, we have festival and parades, we have sports. All of these events or projects are different in that some are ongoing throughout the year, some are seasonal, some are multi-events, and some are single events. So when the committee looks at these applications, they look at all of these things, and they look at each one on an individual basis because they each have different aspects that the committee needs to consider. Also, the current committee that we have has established committee operating policies and procedures that they have in place. There is a copy of that in the packet as well. And since we're talking about the committee, we do need to get some new committee members. There are a good many of our committee that their terms will expire. So we need to address that soon and get some new people on the committee. Some of the members will need to reapply. I think it would be good to have some on there that are already on there to have that history of what the eligible expenditures are and things like that. Then we have the council allocations. City council in recent years have made commitments to funding groups for special considerations, such as surplus, which you guys just discussed, which only exists when revenues exceed budgeted projections and when allocations are not fully expended. Allocations are one-time and not added to annually. Allocations are considered reoccurring. All organizations, projects, and events must meet the following requirements. The organization or fiscal agent must have a nonprofit status with documentation from the South Carolina Secretary of State's office or be exempt from federal income tax under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. It must be in the city limits. It must promote the attraction of tourists in the city. Council has determined a tourist to be anyone traveling from outside of the city limits. Project or event must be completed during the fiscal year in which they are funded. Must be for eligible hospitality expenditures in compliance with the state code and city guidelines. Completed application must be submitted for consideration by the committee and approval for council. All materials submitted for H-Tax grant funding are subject to disclosure based on the Freedom of Information Act. Organizations that are granted funding, the disbursement requests carry the following conditions. The city has the right to audit the organizations funded. The recipient organizations are subject to ongoing evaluations by city staff, and the goal of these evaluations is to encourage self-sufficiency for each organization or program funded through the use of additional or alternative funding sources. Grantees are required to include the City of Columbia logo and the Experience Columbia, South Carolina logo on all program, project, advertising, marketing, and promotional materials. Signed statement of assurance accompanying award notification is required to distribute funds. The city will encourage a mentorship program for organizations funded. The city provides an online calendar as additional marketing for organizations funded. Written requests are required for disbursement, and they must include invoices or contracts verifying eligible expenditures consistent with the application budget, and a list of their other sources of funding. Quarterly allocations are made when applicable. A portion of funding may be obtained in advance. Backup must be submitted within 30 days after the event. All requests for funding and/or to carry forward funding must be received by May 30th or may be subject to penalty. That's kind of a breakdown of what our current process and policies are. Regarding some of the things that we talked about and moving forward, I've made a list of the internal goals and enhancements. The first one, of course, being just to get council's guidance and resolution of the policy and procedure amendments as we move forward with eligible expenditures, to prepare for the 2019 and 2020 year. To merge the manual process to electronic, utilizing the review and reporting portion of Zoom grants. A lot of it currently is done manually. When groups are funded, they submit their request on their organizational letterhead, and we look at what they've turned in on their application. We compare it to their budget, make sure the expenditures are eligible, make sure that they have the appropriate backup invoices and receipts. So we do all that, or in the past, everything was looked at as it came in. With the electronic process, and going into this a little bit further down, we will, when we send out an approval letter, after council has approved an amount, have them turn in, when they turn in the application, they turn in the budget for eligible expenditures. After they're approved an amount, turn in a budget of what amount that they're going to expend, rather than just what they requested and the eligible expenditures, to have them turn in a budget now that they know what they were funded, what these will go towards. And it breaks it down into what the eligible expenditures are. And doing that electronically would also help us keep an eye on what areas those funds are going into, marketing, advertising, operations, who uses what, rather than it being in a separate file for each one. We would have that accountability online and have everything right there. Councilman Rickman, I know you mentioned the 990s. With it being done that way, we can immediately see, is this when they request their funds, is their 990, is it updated? Do we have all of that information? Rather than having to pull the paperwork for each one, we can still have their files, but we'll also have that right there in front of us. I just think it would streamline it a little bit better. And with that also, in the review portion of Zoom grants, when the committee reviews all of the data points that are in the application, when they review it, it would give them an opportunity to make their notes in each section, what they're giving back to the community, how their attendance was, all of those different data points that we currently have in place. That would give them a better way to record that as we go through and fund the organizations or recommend their funding. Creating online workshops in addition to, we currently hold public workshops, but also to have them available online so organizations can go and do small workshops to see how they can do things on Zoom grants or what it takes to apply for the application. It will be readily available instead of waiting for just the public workshops that we already have. Create pre-application to screen applicants on the status for meeting eligibility requirements. Currently, that's in the application, meaning when an organization applies for hospitality funding, they start filling out the application, they find out they're not eligible, they've already spent so much time entering their information, have a pre-screen where it says if they're eligible or not. And then they can, if they are eligible, they can move forward with submitting the application and completing it. And if they're not eligible, they would not move forward with that process. Create a grant agreement to replace the statement of assurance, which is, right now we have a statement of assurance in place that they sign, and a copy of that is in the packet as well. Replacing that with a grant agreement, just mainstreaming everything once they are funded that they sign, that goes in their file. Edit the award notification letter in preparation for the grant agreement to request the following: the line item budget form, which would be the budget after they receive the expenditures or what they were approved for. They resubmit the line item budget to follow with what they have to spend. Implementation of their plan and timeline of their event. All updated and requires forms such as the 990. And that will help too with if any of that changes, if they change, as we fund eligible expenditures. So if they spend more on advertising and media than they spent, that they were originally going to spend in entertainment, They can still change that through Zoom grants, but we would have it all right there that that's what they're changing. As well as the timeline of their event. If their event changes for some reason, they would have to do that on Zoom grants as well. Mandatory grant administration training sessions, which would just help the organizations in submitting their request and their receipts online. Also wanted to look at moving up the timeline. The organizations, they base their budget on this and what they are funded. So possibly moving up the timeline, being able to discuss it when the budget's being discussed, so that things aren't rushed and it streamlines a little bit better.
Dee Dee, I'm sorry, before you
Yes.
go on,
Yes, ma'am.
two things. I like the, pre-application. I think that would save a lot of heartache, especially with some of the smaller committees who go through the whole process and then they're not funded and they're upset, and then they figure out it wasn't eligible. So I think that helps. But the trainings, currently they're not mandatory.
Right.
I mean, I think that might be something we also might want to consider is making the training ahead of time mandatory. Because what I do find, and this goes to, I think, some of the smaller groups or some of the newer groups, and their frustration then comes to our council frustration that they don't get funded. And when you really look at the whole process, they've done something wrong on their application. They're submitting something that's not eligible. And again, I feel like we've run into playing into the false narrative that there's some kind of discrimination happening because they're not getting funded, when in reality, when you peel back the layers, there's something that wasn't done correctly, not to their fault, but that they didn't know this needed to be done or turned in or whatever. So it might be useful for us to have, just like, there are a lot of grants and things that you can't apply for unless you go through the information session, training, and have an opportunity to ask questions. So we may want to consider that and see if, on a trial basis, to see if that helps with some of the issues that we systemically have year after year.
I think you add to that, you put on a disclaimer on it. Just because you fill it out and you come to it doesn't guarantee funding at the level that you request or any at all. I mean, I think people have false expectations that if they do it, they're gonna get funded, even if they're eligible. So I agree with you, the pre-screening would probably save a lot of headache and heartache. And making training and everything else a requirement, that's not a bad idea at all.
I think one of the problems we have is the H-tax pot of money and the community promotions pot of money have gotten blurred over the years,
We
especially.
don't have a community promotion.
Well, but we have had, and people got used to getting funds out of that, and they didn't care where it was coming from, whether it was community promotions or whether it was H-tax. And now they think everything can be funded through H-tax, which it can't.
Right. And also moving when I was talking about the timeline, it's a short time period. Staff I try to always review the applications. We start accepting them, and there's probably about a 2-month time period to fill out the application. Screen them as they come in for Councilman Devine, what you were speaking about, make sure if they've done something wrong, even if they've been to a training workshop, if they've done something wrong, filled out something wrong, if there's any way that we can help them or, just get it right so that when the committee, if they put something in the wrong spot or didn't understand it correctly, we can have those in line before the committee reviews them. But a lot of times we'll receive a good many of them on the last day, and because of the way the timeline is now, we have a short period of time where they're the ones we get at the last minute and having to screen those before we meet with the committee, and then the committee has to have time to review over 100 applications, so it's a very short amount of time to get that done with. So if we could possibly move up the timeline just a little bit, that would just help a little bit more with that, hopefully, as well, if we could do that. I made a anticipated timeline, just to kind of give you some guidance on what's done when. And of course, this month, the council resolution of the guidelines, policies, and procedures. In October, I'd like to talk about the committee terms that are ending, any openings that are available, and moving forward with getting a committee in place so that when we do get the new applications, because once the committee's in place, I will need to get with them and train them on Zoom grants, how they review the applications, and each aspect of that. So I need some time to do that as well.
Has Shanique advertised that?
She has advertised it, I think twice. I need to verify that with her, but she, I need to get with her and see how many she has on file.
Yeah, we need to look at that.
Do you need us to endorse this calendar? Because I read it here and see it there. I mean, I don't have an issue. I actually think this makes more sense than the way we've been doing it.
This is enough time for you to get your information out, get them back, and then go through your different.
Hopefully. I only moved it up by, usually the applications are due January 30th until the beginning of March. So I only moved that up, I just moved it up a month.
I'm asking, is that enough time?
I hope it will be. I'm anticipating it will be. So it would be a, it would be a trial. I definitely think it would help. If I've researched a little bit to see what other counties are doing, what their timeline is, and it varies. They're all around the same time. The earliest one was starting at the beginning of December. In November, applications for H Tax Advisory Committee would be presented. If we could appoint some within that time, because December is when we'll be getting the application ready for the website so that it can go live January 1st. So that month would also be crucial to having new members, training them so that when the applications start coming in, they can review them as they come in. It would just give them a jump start instead of they could just see them and then they can make their notes after the due date once all of them are in. But it would also give them a chance just as they come in, and with the final submission, they could go ahead and start reviewing those.
You want us to endorse this, Ms. Wilson?
It would help Dee Dee out, I think so, yes.
So can we tonight, does anybody have an objection to endorsing the calendar for 2019
I think it's
that
good.
she's proposed?
I'm just
Yes, sir.
concerned that you have enough time, given the number of applications that comes in. That's number one. And then with new members, several new members this time, you think that's enough time for them to get oriented? Just asking. If you're comfortable with that, fine, but if you need more time.
Well, I would love more time, but I think we're all tight on what falls where, and getting it to council, and when the reviewing, looking at the applications, if we could get it moved up sooner, that would be great.
I think you got incredibly broad consensus. You might want to stop while you're ahead. Yeah. Fair enough? All right.
Okay.
See what happens when you wait? You get people who just love on you. Thank you, Dee. You're doing great work.
I did want to touch on
Please.
one more thing. That I wanted to touch on the eligible expenditures.
I'll move the table.
I know that's a
I'm
big
just
one.
joking.
So I've listed on here, the next couple of slides, everything you guys are familiar with, the state law, and that's in the packet as well, and our policies and procedures as far as eligible expenditures. It's the same ones that are listed in our guidelines, but they're on the slides as well. I'm not going to go through each one because we've been through them before, but we can go through them as we discuss them. But they're there for you to look at in the printouts as well. The things I did want to touch on as far as some of the eligible expenditures were in the examples of possibly eligible expenditures where it says a portion of the salary employees, that is a percentage of the marketing. If they have a person that's doing their marketing, not giving it to another marketing company to do. If they're doing their marketing, they get a percentage of that, and that's determined by the board.
So if they have an executive director, and the
That-
executive director does the marketing,
She could take a portion,
she can take a portion.
or he.
That's correct.
Right, but it could not
She or he.
be, she would have to do, she or he would have to do a majority of that, of the marketing, the management, marketing and the management of marketing, and not giving that out. It couldn't be, it has to be one or the other. Operations. Most of our, I mentioned earlier, the different groups. And most of those groups, the arts and cultural, the parades and festivals, things like that, the majority of our groups use marketing and advertising, security, entertainment. But I think one of the major questions was on the operations and the eligible expenditures that are within those operations. So what I did, I just looked at previous or past expenditures, the ones who do use this, and not all of them use it, the ones who do use it, eligible expenditures in the past that have went under this. And this is what I would need your guidance. If we want to change any of these or be more specific, we would need your guidance on that. But in the past, payroll for instance, anyone using the Clean and Safe, payroll for the people that do that, cell phones, uniforms, supplies, it could be office supplies or supplies specifically for Clean and Safe, gas, we have street beautification, vehicle service, vehicle insurance, parking, and in the past, some meals were covered for the crew who were doing that. And I know we had spoke about gift cards before. Those were incentives for that program itself. But those are things that were done in the past moving forward. And if we want to be specific about what's eligible and ineligible, we would need guidance
I
on.
think we gotta be specific,
Yeah.
because
Well, I
those aren't
asked her to-
eligible.
I asked her to throw out a list just so you get kind of the flavor of what she's talking about. And if you don't want to get in the weeds right here, then I'd like some feedback about it, but she can go back and work with legal to give you a recommendation.
I think we
going
need a
forward.
recommendation. I think it needs to be very tight.
Mr. Duval?
I think that the ones that are giving us the problem are most of the cleaning safe, trying to get that. And to me, there should be some way that we can establish a contract, or let's say the Vista Guild can establish a contract with Cleaning Safe that they will, for $115,000, provide Cleaning Safe to include 3 people that will keep the streets clean, instead of having to go through all of the minutia of whether or not they're buying Coca-Colas or other things.
And
That's the one that gives you the most problem, isn't it?
yes, sir. And the grant agreement that I was speaking of earlier, that would, if we can come up with something and go through legal, that would be in the grant agreement.
Yeah.
And that is when they are approved for funding, that's what they would need to sign. That's where it would specify, it would give the specifics of the expenditures.
And I think that's where Margie Reese can help us, because she works with organizations all over the United States that get around this minutia of accounting.
I don't think the word "get around" is what you're looking for.
Well, I am looking for I'm looking for a get around. I think that it's terrible that we have to, they're gonna provide that service in a specific area, contract for a year, and they should not have to,
But look at the way they're doing it now, Howard. I mean, you say that, but look how they're doing it now. You got a group that's getting paid by a third party. We're paying one of the directors to manage it. A percentage of their salary goes to manage it, but yet we're paying a management fee to that clean and safety. We're giving them incentives of gift cards out of our hospitality money. We're paying them for their toilet paper, to their Diet Cokes, to whatever. We're paying for the plant. I mean, but you also have that same group that's generating a revenue stream from things. So when we talk about money being allocated to help things, this is what I call an abuse of the hospitality money. So I think it does need to be defined. I don't want to walk around. I want a distinct line item. This is what your money can be used for. And if you don't use it and we audit it that way, then you're going to have to pay us back, not out of our own hospitality money, out of your operating budget.
there again, the problem,
Or risk funding, respectively.
the problem we have is with the clean and safe organizations. And if City Center can contract with Clean and Safe to provide the services, then we shouldn't have to be looking at every invoice to see if they bought a Coca-Cola or a Moon Pie.
They're probably not gonna do it. Let me ask a question just on those two comments. In this case, what is the difference between someone being paid as a director and as a marketing person?
Well, I think if you use a portion to do marketing, that makes, I get that, but we also, at some point, you have to look at it, if an organization is looking for assistance, what are their other costs associated with it? Because if it's consistently, but they can afford to do 10 other things, then maybe their priority's not there. I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of factors in this.
Let's look at it in a different direction. What if, and this is just theoretical, so if anybody's listening, this is just
It's Howard that's speaking.
This is just a theoretical. What if the city of Columbia contracted with ABC street cleaning business, and for $300,000, we tell them you're going to be cleaning Main Street, the Vista area, and 5 Points? Would we require them to bring us every little receipt for that $300,000, or would we contract with them for $300,000 and we just make sure?
Well, we certainly wouldn't be giving them gift cards.
Obviously,
we
the
certainly
cards
wouldn't-
hit a nerve.
Keep this moving, y'all.
We certainly wouldn't pay for plant liners and other things like that. My point is if folks are eligible to receive the money, then it needs to be used correctly. We are at fault partly because we've accepted these expenses, which puts other groups at a disadvantage who haven't been able to. So we need to have a distinct guideline that everybody plays by the rules, period.
So moving forward, if I could get something together of how the agreement would look and get some feedback from you guys through email, get something together, get with legal, we could do it that way.
You got that, Teresa?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain, I can talk about executive session, but we got limits on what we can do legally. We've talked.
Actually, we don't have to give anybody any
Yeah, I
money.
don't-
We
that's
could
what we
actually
want,
use
though.
it ourselves.
We just wanna be able to be consistent, I think.
I just don't, I don't know that we're gonna make it any easier, cause we need the receipts and the things that they're getting now
Yes.
audited. And I don't know a way around that, so we would.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, and
It's the
the
gentleman
grant
from
agreement
McGregor
would be,
Street that's
Drive,
excuse me, is trying to get a get around.
we'd still need the receipts, and then, I didn't clarify that, but we would still definitely we always need the receipts, invoices.
So why don't
To
y'all
make
put
sure that
something
they're
together and
eligible.
bring it back to us? I mean, I think if we can establish that correctly, I think we can incorporate that into the tier. The other thing that I would say that I think is that we ought to look at is not giving capital anymore, but only doing advertising and other eligible expenses. Because capital ought to be raised internally. That's called skin in the game.
Well, we
big
don't,
policy
we don't
change.
give 100%.
It is a big policy change, but if you look at it, what it'll allow us to do, it'll allow us to help more
Stretch
groups.
money a whole lot more. Stretch it.
So I think it's something we ought to consider.
Say that again.
You also wouldn't have Nickelodeon on
No
Main
longer
Street.
doing
I don't believe that, and I'll give you an example why, Howard. So Douglas Wilder took over as the mayor of Richmond. All right, when he took over, the streets and everything were so bad that he said no more funding of arts and everything else until these streets are fixed. You know what happened? Imagine this. The private sector stepped in and funded arts. They have one of the largest endowments and the most growing arts community and beautiful community there. My point is, we're not trying to cut off anybody, but to say we're not going to have the capital is not true. We have become an outlet because everybody knows there's $12 million a year to get cut up.
All right. Rock and roll.
One quick thing as well. Earlier we talked about the new organizations. Just wanting to make a quick note. The Cinco de Mayo was new to the committee this year, and at the time that they came before the committee, they had not had their event and had the numbers or anything yet when they made their decision.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions? Or?
That's it. Very good.
Good job, Dee.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dee.
Yes, ma'am.
So we'll put together some recommendations and probably email those to you all for in the essence of time and bring them back.
Can we check with our auditor and other cities to see what they do, and specifically with organizations like cleaning service?
Okay, I don't necessarily recommend pushing the envelope with the auditor, but we can check a little bit.
I think what we're going to do is just
Ask
get
the
some good
question.
ground rules
Ask the
that we can
question.
incorporate. I mean, I think that's the best way to do it.
You didn't have anything?
Watching and billing.
Okay, thank
Question,
you.
Dee?
Thank you, Didi.
Thank you, Dee.
Thanks, Dee.
Good job.
And thank you all. I know this is a little tedious, but has to be done.
It's been great.
All right, for the executive session, I think we have an item we need to add, so I'm not sure who's gonna read the motion.
Mr. Duval enjoys that.
Item 6.
Does it so well.
if
You do it so well.
Okay, Mr. Blackhall, if you could add Finley Park, item 6, please.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we go into executive session for the receipt of legal advice of pending and threatened or potential claim under section 30-4-70A. Mac Wells versus City of Columbia, Alan Reuter versus Columbia, Sylvester Batts versus Columbia. Discussion of negotiations institute proposed purchase of property pursuant to 70A2 Metro wastewater treatment. Receipt of legal advice related to matters covered by attorney-client privilege pursuant to 70A2 storm drain easements, northeast sewer service area, transit lavatories. Discussion of matters related to proposed location or expansion of services to encourage the location or expansions of industry or other business pursuant to 70A2 Finley Park, proposed parking incentive ordinance. Discussion of negotiations and proposed contractual arrangement pursuant to 70A2 Lower Richland Satellite Sewer Agreement.
Second.
So we're subject.
Is there a second?
So we're
Davis?
subject.
Any discussion? The previous question? Clerk call the roll.
Aye.
Yes.
Aye.
So the same extension we.
Ask.
Aye.
If we could stay down.